It's called an octahedron. Why? Because it has 8 faces. And in this video, I hope to help you become able to make one by fusing marbles together in a process that's, well, rather inexpensive and not too difficult. And as you can tell, it produces quite a result. Okay, in the first part of this video, I'll show you how to make this little guy. But I have something planned for the second part of this video that will be a little bit bigger. Step 1 is marble sizing. So let's get started.
The easy way is to use a size sorting machine like this one. With it, we can remove any marbles that are either too large or too small. And of course, there will be a link to a video about this gizmo at the end of this video.
There are simpler ways. We only need 19 marbles altogether in order to make an octahedron. So this method only uses 2 pieces of glass. We can tell when we roll it around gently that 3 of these marbles must be larger than the others. We can use this technique to refine our marble set by picking them out. Now, of course, we don't have to size our marbles at all, but doing so will make the build process a lot easier later on. The more closer these marbles are in size, the neater their geometry will be when we fit them together. This is a setup that's a bit more complicated, but it's also certain to give us better results. I have a glass coffee table that I've stuck shims underneath to make the glass slope in this direction. And this is a different piece of glass that's resting on a pad of sticky notes here and 2 average-sized marbles. The pad of sticky notes back there is smaller than these 2 marbles, so it has a mild slope. And the 2 marbles determine an imaginary line. So, any marble that we run down it should stop somewhere in here. And if it's close to this line, it means that it's close to the same diameter as the 2 control marbles. If the marble's too big, it'll stop before it gets there. And if it's too small, it'll pass right through. So, using this idea, we can make a distribution. Now, any marbles that are too far away from our 2 control marbles, we just pull out and get rid of them.
Okay, on to the first build.
We're going to be using Play-Doh, so if you're under 2 years of age, you probably shouldn't attempt this project. We're starting off with a piece that's about the size of a bouncy ball, or about 1 inch. That's 2.54 centimeters. And for those of you adults who can't remember, keep it in your palm and just roll gently. An octahedron is kind of complicated. There are a lot of angles to it, so it will help if we think of it instead as 2 pyramids. That way we can build it bottom up. Our foundation is going to consist of 9 marbles with 1 in the center that's either clear or light blue. Why? Because if light can pass through the center, it increases the brilliance. It just makes it prettier. This is the hardest part of the process. You want to be sure that they're as square and straight and just perfect as you can possibly get them. And this might take some looking over them. You want to keep them on the same plane by using the 2 pieces of glass to keep them all flat this way. But we also want to keep them straight and square. You really want to take your time with this part and make sure that they look perfect. Also, you can put the Play-Doh under a little bit of compression like this, just to keep the marbles from drifting back away from the center. I know, get on with it. But one final point. Don't press them too deep into the Play-Doh. because we're making a bond right here in the middle and it has to have space to get all the way around.
Take a close look at the bond. It's two-part epoxy. It gives the finished product a wet appearance that makes it seem like the marbles were welded. But actually the process I'm about to show you has way more in common with soldering. And that's because solder moves towards heat. Before we think about that, first consider water. The surface tension in a liquid can make it act sort of sticky, and so liquids can sometimes crawl or climb. This property is often called capillary action, and it's how water can spread through the fibers of a paper towel or up a thin tube. And we're going to use a variation of this idea to draw our little tiny globs of epoxy into a perfect position between two spheres. Humor me for a moment and I'll show you how to do it first without using any glue. So I'll be putting a little drop of glue right here on the toothpick, and then I'll scrape it really quickly, just like that. Think of scraping mud off the bottom of your shoe. Still, the real secret here is heat. Marbles warmed up by a heat gun or a hairdryer will reduce the viscosity of the epoxy enough for this capillary bridge to take place. Viscosity just means resistance to flow, so simply put, a drop of epoxy will naturally center itself between two warm marbles. The trick to getting good-looking connections is heat. I can't stress it enough. And now we just remain patient for a half hour. Half of an hour is long enough, but the toothpick is also a great indicator. Toothpicks are also a great way to mix and apply a small amount of epoxy. When I zoom back to put this into perspective, it might be misleading with all of my up-close shots just how much I'm using. I'm only mixing about a water droplet sized amount of each of the liquids. Okay, it's ready. The lid just keeps the dough soft. Now just twist. Okay, the next 5 marbles. A little bit of denatured alcohol on a washcloth. Get them nice and clean, because if you want strong connections, start with clean marbles. It gets a better adhesion. And just how strong are these connections? They're very strong. Unbelievably strong. We're not going to make every single connection all at once. We're looking for the sweet spot where this marble touches this marble. And there are 4 of those. We're going to put a glob on each of those 4 spots. Then finally there will be 4 sweet spots for the crown marble, but we're only going to try to get one of them at first, and then we'll come back and do all of the connections with a second pass. That's it. Now we wait. Keeping it nice and warm, not hot, just nice and warm. And now I come through and find every one of those little connections. There's quite a bunch of them. And hit them all. And you'll see that it will cover quite a gap. Some of them will be large, especially if you didn't size the marbles well, or if this is your first attempt. But no worries. You can also, take your time and make multiple passes if you have to. You don't have to do this entire part in one sitting.
If your goal was only to make a pyramid, you can stop there. But if you want to keep going and make an octahedron, this little adjustable jig will help. We just turn it upside down and repeat by doing the same thing we just did. And now I wait again another 15 minutes and then I finish the remaining connections. You don't need to see that part, you get the idea. If you're still a little bit uncertain about attempting epoxy, you can go watch my previous video, the one about the BB hands. There are some helpful tips in that. I will also put a supplemental video on my second channel for how to make these sorts of hanging things and this clever little copper stand. This stand has epoxy right here in its binding, so I'll be sure to include some epoxy usage tips in that video. But for now, it's time to move to the second part, and I'm going to attempt to really challenge myself. It turns out that there's more than one way to stack spheres on top of one another, so I considered a couple different approaches to building this thing. I'll talk a bit about what I mean later on, but for now, let's stick with this. Once again, let's think of the octahedron as just a set of two pyramids. The top pyramid has 3 layers in this case, and the bottom pyramid only has 2. So if we're always thinking of it this way, we'll always have a top pyramid that has one more layer than our bottom pyramid. A 4-sided pyramid like this one has a pretty simple mathematical description. It's just the sum of the squares of all of its layers. Whoa, okay, it's not bad, just listen. 1 squared plus 2 squared plus 3 squared plus 4 squared plus 5 squared. 5 squared just means 5 times 5, which is 25. If we add all of those up, we get the total number of marbles. Adding all of this up can become tedious, so there's a mathematical notation that helps to simplify it. All this says is that we're going to start at 1, end at 5, we're going to square all of those numbers, and we're going to add them all up. That's why it's called a summation. So now I'm going to attempt to build an octahedron that has 8 marbles across one length. And in order to do that, I will have to have one pyramid that has an 8 and one pyramid that has a 7. And the respective number of marbles will be 204 and 140. That's a grand total of 344 marbles altogether. But just to further complicate things, I'm not going to make them all the same color. So remember, I want to maximize the amount of light that can pass through the center of this thing. So what I'll do is make the interior light blue and wrap it in a skin of green. The problem becomes, how many blue marbles and how many green marbles does this take? Well, we can think of the interior blue octahedron as just having two less layers on both the top and the bottom. And so we can just figure out this and then subtract the difference. Since it has 2 less layers than 8 on top, it has 6 layers, and it has 5 on the bottom. 6 here, 5 here. So, figuring this out, it's 146 marbles. Subtract that from the total, and you get 198 green. In case you want to make one even larger than the one I'm about to make, here's the general formula. If you want to see its derivation, check the description. Okay, on with the build. Okay, here goes. Wish me luck. I made these as close to 90 degrees as I am capable, and they're just a little bit smaller than 8 marbles.
I thought about trying to build this foundation a bunch of different ways, but I decided to try the most basic approach first. It's still not as easy as it looks, though. If the marbles aren't sized well, this might not work well at all. You should note that I'm applying a gentle pressure from the left side just to hold them together. As the epoxy starts to thicken, you can feel the structure start to solidify. This part is actually easier than it looks. It didn't take more than an hour's worth of work, and that's with mixing epoxy about 4 or 5 times.
And hopefully that was the hard part. Next up, the fun part.
All of these connections were made without any real pattern. The reason for this is because your eyes are quickly moving back and forth, which becomes disorienting. So it's just way easier to make a connection wherever your eyes happen to land, and then just slowly work your way around the pyramid.
Now, of course, you could put a bond between every marble, but that's really an overkill. This is plenty strong enough, and this way is much faster. If this bothers you, then now is the time to address it. You can still get to the loose marbles from here. That also makes a great math problem. If you were to make every possible connection, just how many would you be making? More than I want to do.
After doing it for a while, I started to prefer placing them one at a time. I settled into kind of a dab-dab-drop routine. Only the green to blue connections have to be done this way, because you can't get to them later. I made the green to green strengthening connections any and every which way, with no real pattern or urgency. This is a very pleasant art form. In fact, if it weren't for having to record the process, I would have found it to be relaxing and therapeutic.
Not yet. The top 4 didn't lock into place as well as the rest of them did. They kind of rolled around. So I used a piece of glass and then measured from side to side in all 4 cardinal directions. That balanced it out nicely enough so that it's able to do this. First, I build the structure by making all the connections between the blues and the greens. Then I come back through and address all the green to green connections. That really strengthens it up. And at last, the cherry on top. I didn't want it to become too confusing earlier, so I left this part out. These are radically different ways to stack spheres, but they use the same lattice. So imagine that you have layers like this, and we'll just let these represent layers. This is complicated, and it's hard to visualize. So all I can do is plant the seed and then send you on your way. But take a look. In this lattice, all three of these marbles are aligned. But in this one, they are not, because these two marbles line up with the center of these two marbles in this plane. Told you it's difficult, you'll have to take some time to think about it. But these two actually have the same lattice, and I didn't want to say that because it would be confusing, but look, even though this was tetrahedral, there's an octahedron in it. I hope that you found some enjoyment in this video. See you next time.